So let's begin with the FDA Investigator and Compliance Programs. So first, folks typically want to know, well, why me? Why are we being investigated? Why are we having an FDA audit? First of all, what happens is that the Centers for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER for drugs, and Food Safety and Applied Nutrition for dietary supplements, do the planning for what the audit process and schedules will be. And the requirement actually is that they should be auditing facilities every 2 years. They try to maintain that, but sometimes not able to due to resource constraints. Priority is based on how high the risk assessment is of the products that your company is making. Also, the largest consumer exposure. What kind of volume production do you have? How many customers are you impacting? And any previous history you've had with the FDA, and all that will determine how frequently the FDA will try to get to your facility. As a result of that prioritization process, not all areas of the regulations will necessarily be covered, or is impossible to cover during a single inspection. So it's just something to keep in mind that any inspection, particularly these as well, by the FDA, are essentially snapshots of certain things they're going to be looking for, and they'll be covering as much as they can, but not necessarily all the requirements. So who is the investigator? Well, first of all, he is or she is a fact finder looking for evidence, evidence of essentially non-compliance. The investigator will have variable experience and generally flexible and cross-trained. A thing to keep in mind here is that the FDA investigator is not your friend, but neither is the FDA investigator your enemy. It is quite normal, and in our experience, quite often the case, that when the investigator understands that you're serious about being in compliance and working together to achieve a good state of compliance, there can be a very productive, positive relationship with the inspector. He or she is charged with protecting the public health, willing to work with you if you are serious about getting into that good state of compliance. The investigator may have life science degrees in things like engineering, pharmacy, chemist, microbiologist, could have job-related training as investigative techniques, law and regulations, performing inspections themselves, and laboratory methods and techniques for analysts. It's important to note that the FDA aims to have good calibration among its inspectors, but it's not always successful in achieving that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So you may find variable experiences with different investigators during an FDA inspection. Now, there are numerous compliance programs associated with what the FDA inspector will be concerned about. And the inspector will have had instructions given to them from the centers to the field offices on the purpose of the inspection program, how many inspections to conduct, what specifically to be looking for, samples to collect, how to analyze the samples, what regulatory action to consider for non-compliant firms, those sorts of things. And there are additional compliance programs that the inspector will be concerned with during the inspection. These are in addition to and inclusive of the actual CGMPs themselves. So this is first one, a list here showing some of the current compliance programs for drug-related operations. And I won't go into detail about any of them, except to mention a few there that you may be particularly concerned about knowing the content of, and that is those that are marked in red: post-marketing adverse drug experiences, drug repackagers and relabelers, and active pharmaceutical ingredients. So there are programs related to all things on this slide that could well be part of what the FDA inspector is considering during the investigation. And some additional ones. The first one there, the drug manufacturing inspections themselves, and also things like the OTC monograph implementation. So there are many things that the FDA inspector could be concentrating on during an inspection beyond just the CGMP for, in this case, drug regulations for GMPs, 21 CFR 210 and 211. The same thing is true for dietary supplements, and you may all understand that dietary supplements are regulated under foods, and as you see, as highlighted in red, it's only one of the compliance programs of many also for foods. And just to highlight a few of those that are on that list, for dietary supplements, there would be concerns around labeling, around NDI notifications, that's new dietary ingredient notifications. The Dietary Supplement and Non-Prescription Drug Consumer Protection Act, DSHEA, which includes a requirement to report serious adverse events. And then there could be other concerns under seafood HACCP and juice HACCP programs, and HACCP, for those who may not know, is hazard and critical control point analysis. So that would be situations for seafood and juice. And then there could be other things that could apply to your operations if you're dealing with liquids where there may be regulatory requirements around low acid canned foods and acidified foods. The FDA also issues a program, compliance program and guidances. An example of those for dietary supplements would be a compliance program for dietary supplements import and domestic. That's a program that has been proposed. It's still in draft form. Also, guidance for industry, GMPs essentially for small entity, as a small entity compliance guide. Explaining the dietary supplement GMPs for in a way that may be a little more clear for small companies. We find it not to be very different from the GMPs themselves, so you may not want to spend a lot of time on that, but it's there for your reference. Other guidance and additional information from the FDA website would be dietary supplements, new dietary ingredient notifications, as an example, guidance for industry on liquid dietary supplements for beverages, and there are other significant pieces of information on the FDA website, as noted there. There's lots of information there, and the whole point of sharing all of this is to let you know there's a lot more involved in an FDA inspection than just the GMPs themselves, and you should try to become familiar as you can with all these various compliance requirements. A very interesting document to become familiar with is the Investigations Operations Manual, which the FDA issues and uses to train its inspectors. It's a how-to guide for them, and what it does essentially is it tells you exactly what these inspectors are going to be looking for and how they're going to go about conducting the investigation, the inspection. A recent update in that operations manual that's important to be aware of is in Chapter 5, they updated a section on Food Safety Modernization Act around reinspection user fees and in-plant photographs. These are things you need to be aware of so that you can effectively work with the inspector as the inspection goes forward. And let me discuss that just a little bit further. Reinspection fees, the FDA, first of all, will provide at the time of the inspection an information sheet that explains reinspection fees. And they can be there can be subsequent reinspection fees as well for violations that will be documented during the inspection. So reinspection fees can be assessed to any reinspection that's necessary or multiple or subsequent reinspections. It's something to be aware of. They can become significant, as I'll explain in a moment. Here's an example where warning letters have also emphasized and communicated the fact that the FDA has authority now to impose reinspection fees. And these reinspection fees, as indicated in red there, will likely include all expenses, including administrative expenses, incurred in connection with FDA's arranging, conducting, and evaluating the results of the reinspection, and assessing and collecting the reinspection fees. So anything at all related to the reinspection, conducting any investigations they need to, actually going after collecting the fees, all part of what they can collect fees for. The guidance for industry that has been issued by the FDA on this very subject. So it's enough to let you know they're serious about this, and they do intend to collect reinspection fees when it's appropriate. As an example, for 2016, the hourly rate that they will be charging is $221 if no foreign travel is required, or $315 an hour if it is. And again, it can include and cover multiple compliance reinspections. And as an example, what this could mean is if typically a reinspection could involve 40 hours and commonly might involve more than one inspector, one investigator, so let's say two at $221 an hour, so that's almost $18,000, but that does not include travel, prep, report writing, sample testing, and other follow-up actions. So it's not beyond the scope of imagination that these reinspection fees could easily be $20,000 to $30,000 for each reinspection. What about implant photographs? The FDA will not request permission to take photographs. They believe they have the authority, and they cite court cases to prove that. And that basically is what this slide is explaining, that there are several court cases that they reference that says we have the authority to take photographs. And if challenged, the FDA will cite that authority and those court cases. However, if you, as a company, decide to refuse to have photographs taken, the FDA then will simply want to contact your legal counsel, and FDA will contact their legal counsel as well, and the discussion will go further if you continue to object to photographs being taken. EAS strongly suggests that you do not fight this issue about implant photos. We believe it is not worth the fight, and you don't want to be confrontational with the FDA. You don't want to have a negative interaction with them if you can avoid it. In this particular case, we believe it's not in your best interest to try to prevent photos from being taken. Keep in mind why the inspector wants to take photos. It's to demonstrate and provide evidence. The key here is evidence of non-compliance observations, things like rodents or insects, faulty construction or maintenance, raw material and product storage conditions that are not appropriate, problems with product labels and labeling, visible contamination to raw materials or finished products or equipment. Remember that photos are not normally taken to show good examples. Sometimes they may be taken to show current state-of-the-art equipment or some particular demonstrated practice in place, but that's not normally the case. Normally it's to provide evidence of non-compliance. All right, so let's move on now to the FDA Inspection Authority. So what is the FDA inspection? Well, it is an inspection that is a careful, critical, official examination of a facility to determine its compliance with certain laws administered by the FDA. These inspections, as we've mentioned briefly, may be used to obtain evidence to support legal action when violations are found, and if the FDA were to deem it appropriate to take legal action, and also to gain specific information on new technologies, good commercial practices, and data for establishing food standards or drug standards or other regulations. As we said, often we don't see that more commonly being the case, but that can be something that derives from an inspection, particularly when there's a real positive interaction between the company and the FDA inspector. So what about the inspections, FDA's inspectional authority? Well, the FD&C Act authorizes the FDA to enter and inspect at reasonable times, within reasonable limits, and in a reasonable manner your facilities, including the factory, warehouse, establishment, even a vehicle, for instance, a tractor trailer that may be parked on your premises. Any pertinent equipment that's related to any processes that may be investigating and evaluating, exploring, including plant and storage facilities. Finished and unfinished materials, containers, labeling, sample collections, basically anything that is reasonably necessary to achieve, in the FDA inspector's view, the objectives of the inspection. I did want to point out, and I should have said it in an earlier slide, just for your reference, it's important to know that FDA inspections have really been increasing in recent years, and it's even particularly so in the case of dietary supplements. Now, for as an example, from 2008 to 2014, inspections have been up about 400%, nearly 4 times the number of inspections in 2014 compared to 2008. It's also important to know that many of these inspections, and it's 20 to 25% of them, have resulted in FDA warning letters, meaning there were significant problems found and the responses from the company were inadequate. So these are things to keep in mind. More on the inspectional authority. The section of the Act states that that the FDA inspectional authority does not extend to, does not include financial data, sales data, or other shipment data, pricing data, personnel data, and other qualifications for job tasks. That includes, personal data other than qualification for job tasks. That means they can look at training files and any background information on a person's resume or outside qualifications that may be part of what they want to see and are entitled to, but not anything else in a personnel file. And some certain research data may not be subject to inspection by the FDA. The FD&C Act does not require the FDA to pre-announce inspections, and typically there will not be pre-announcements of inspections. The FDA will show up unannounced, and particularly for any for-cause inspection and routine surveillance inspections. So the first thing you'll know about an FDA inspection most of the time is when the inspector knocks at the door. Now, there are concerns around inspections that you want to avoid. And it's important to know that the FD&C Act, again in Section 501J in this case, now deems a drug to be adulterated. This particular wording is around drugs. If it has been manufactured, processed, packed, held in any factory, warehouse, establishment, and the important piece here is, and the owner, operator, or agent of such facilities delays, denies, or limits an inspection or refuses to permit entry. So they're all important. If you delay, if you deny, if you in any way limit or refuse to permit entry for an inspection, the FDA will likely and has the authority to deem your products to be adulterated. And what is so important about that? Once products have been adulterated, you will be prohibited from distributing them. So you want to make sure you're not doing any of these things around delaying, denying, limiting, or refusing inspections. So let's look at some examples of these. What would a delay likely be? Well, if your company does not agree to a proposed inspection date, and all these are if there's no justification. If you can't provide a justification for your position, it will be deemed to be, in this case, a delay. If you do not allow access to an area of the facility until a specific future date or time, even though operations are in place. If you leave an investigator in a conference room, as an example, without access to necessary documents or access to responsible individuals for an unreasonable amount of time. And if the FDA requests records, but the facility fails to produce them in a timely manner. All those things are examples of delay. Examples of denials could be things like, upon arrival at the facility, the company does not allow the investigator to begin the inspection for some reason, giving some reason why we can't begin yet. The facility sends staff home for a day and tells the investigator the facility is not producing any product. We have heard of cases that have done where that's been done, basically shutting down the facility. Or if the company does not allow the FDA to begin the inspection because certain staff members are not present. Any of those examples are examples of denials of inspection. What about examples of limiting an inspection? Facility orders discontinuation of all manufacturing for duration of the inspection. Obviously, that limits an inspection. Yes, the inspector could still walk through the facility, but there's a lot of information he or she could not gather if operations have been discontinued. Facility states direct observation of the manufacturing process, totally or in part, must be limited to an unreasonable amount of time, or an unreasonable or a part of the operation because they may claim it's proprietary, some such thing as that. That would be a limiting factor. Restricts entry to a particular portion of the facility, limits photography, refuses to allow the investigator to review shipping records, provides some but not all of the requested records. In other words, the FDA will commonly be requesting many records during the inspection, and it's expected you will provide all of them. Declining to allow or impeding the FDA collection of samples, including environmental, finished product, raw materials, in-process materials, and reserve samples. So declining any sampling would be an example of limiting. And examples of refusal to permit entry or inspection. If the company bars the investigator from physically entering the facility or certain areas of the facility by not unlocking areas. And by the way, if the FDA experiences this and they feel it's important enough, or they're insistent enough on conducting the investigation, they could return, actually with armed agents, to be sure they enter the facility. So you don't want to be refusing entry. If the company fails to respond to FDA's attempt to contact designated personnel or schedule an inspection. If the facility does not answer calls from the investigator, an investigator actually there in the facility and knowing that there are people there that he should be able to contact, and if calls are not answered, that's an example of a refusal to allow the inspection. Okay, so now let's move forward to the inspection itself. First of all, as the inspector shows up at your facility, he or she will be expected to present his and her individual identification. Next thing that will be presented will be a notice of inspection, an FDA Form 482. And then as the inspection concludes, there will be a formal document, FDA Form 483, that lists the inspectional observations, and then the 484, which will be used to document any samples that the FDA inspectors collected and took with them. Now, there's some important things to keep in mind about what you should do during an inspection or in preparation for one. Most of what's on this slide basically needs to be done in advance. And we strongly recommend that your company always maintain a state of readiness. You can't fix enough things quickly enough to have a significant impact on the inspection if you're not in good compliance or as good as you can be all the time. And it's important to know that having your facility and its procedures and its records in good condition and good shape is vitally important to creating that first one chance to create a good impression. And creating that good impression has a big influence on how the inspection actually proceeds. So your organization, your company needs to support preparation efforts, needs to ensure that work areas are orderly, ensure that all equipment and instruments are clean and calibrated, ensure that all logs, records are filled out completely accurately and legibly, and at the time of performance. And at the time of performance cannot be stressed too heavily. If the FDA inspector were to find documents are being filled out early, in advance of an operation, or at the end when the operation is completed rather than throughout the operation, that's a very serious violation. In fact, the FDA considers that falsification of records. Some more things to do. During the inspection, be sure you answer questions honestly. Be sure to answer the questions directly. Don't guess at what the inspector was asking. If you're not sure, certainly ask the inspector to clarify his question so that you can answer it directly. Responding with "I don't know" is an okay and acceptable response, as long as you also refer the inspector to a person who has the knowledge and the responsibility to properly answer the question. Remember to always be professional, be courteous, and be cooperative. Be prepared and make sure you are fully familiar with the job tasks involved, the products your company is producing, the procedures they're following, the equipment and instruments. That's a short way of saying you need to have a full knowledge of everything that's happening in your business to be able to effectively answer the FDA inspector's questions. And make sure, if you don't feel you have that knowledge, that you have one or two other key people participating with you during the inspection or readily available so that those questions can be answered. Some other don'ts. Do not volunteer information. Many times we find, sometimes we at EAS are asked by clients to conduct a mock FDA inspection. And we do that and go in a rather deliberate way to be as professional as an FDA inspector would be, asking questions, not engaging in a lot of other discussion, which commonly we would during an inspection, and see how the company responds to essentially a mock FDA inspection. We find that many times people that we talk to get excited about what they know or how professional they are or how proud they are, and they start volunteering all kinds of information. Do not do that. That simply opens the door for the FDA inspector to explore other areas that was not part of the original question. So don't volunteer information. Don't guess at answers. Again, get someone there to answer a question if you do not know the answer. Don't provide any misinformation, and don't provide any misleading information. And absolutely, remember, do not be confrontational or argumentative. There is an opportunity at the end of the inspection to discuss things that you may not agree with or for which you need clarification. Restrict doing that during the inspection and save that for the meetings at the end of the day or at the end of the inspection. Now, there are opportunities to manage the inspection in a way that will help have it go in a way that's favorable to you. So first on that list is to have an inspection plan. Develop an SOP if you don't already have one on handling or hosting an FDA inspection. Know what to expect, know what your roles are, know your rights. During the inspection, make sure you have set up procedures to decrease disruptions and ensure a proper response to FDA findings. Prepare for the opening meeting and set up the war room. And we'll talk about the war room in a minute. So if you are able to get yourself in good position on these items, have an inspection plan, know what to expect, know roles, your rights, decrease, eliminate disruptions, ensure proper response when there are findings and it's time to respond to them, and proper preparation for the opening meeting and setting up the war room, things will be much better for you in managing the inspection. So let's talk about the opening meeting. You can set the tone for the inspection by having a well-conducted reception opening meeting. First of all, make sure that the receptionist knows who to contact. The FDA inspector will initially ask to see the highest level authority at that facility. An example of in one case that we experienced with one of our clients when we were doing a mock inspection, a mock FDA inspection, was we asked that question to see the highest level authority, and the relatively new receptionist who hadn't been trained said, "Oh, just a minute, I'll contact the maintenance manager." Well, you can imagine that was not the person that the FDA inspector wanted to see first. Should be the person who's the highest ranking authority at that facility, who is present that day. Ensure that the most reasonable person at the site is immediately available to greet the investigators and accept the notice of inspection. Have department managers and QA/QC officials attend the meeting. And remember that once the inspection begins, QA should take the leadership. For the opening meeting, you should have an appropriately large room, and that room should be out of the way of employee traffic, routes, noise, disruptions, etc. It should be a quiet place. Naturally, there should be a large desk or a table. There'll be lots of need to spread out documents and whatnot, and for taking notes, both by the FDA and by your company folks who are participating, and should be equipped with a slide presentation for a slide presentation on the facility. In preparing a slideshow in advance, which we suggest, make it not more than about a 15-minute or so presentation. It would include things like a description of the organization, showing organizational charts, overview of the facility, floor plan, a listing of the products that are manufactured and marketed. Sometimes a production product flow is helpful to help clarify for the inspector what is actually happening in the production process. Usually a list of key equipment, both production and laboratory equipment. And with some caution, you may want to talk about CGMP accomplishments. And we say they're brag, but only as appropriate. You don't want to overdo that. But if you're particularly proud of, or you know there's been previous comments by in FDA former inspections about you in doing well here, you might want to comment just to make the point that you're on top of CGMP compliance. But make sure you don't do it in a way that tries to convince the FDA inspector that everything is wonderful and he's not going to find anything. Because if you do that, that simply creates a challenge. So do that with caution. For the opening meeting and during the inspection, you want to have copies of the following documents readily available. So again, the organizational charts, facility floor plan diagram, an SOP index. Now the SOP index is a good thing to provide, provided that you're sure it is a good index of a good SOP program. So if you have an index of, for instance, 10 SOPs, you probably don't want to offer that freely without being requested to, because 10 SOPs is quite assuredly not adequate to cover all of that is required to document in compliance with regulations. So if you know you've got a good SOP program, sure, provide the index of the SOPs. Product catalogs, and a copy of the slide presentation, because if the inspector has that, it enables him or her to take notes during the actual show. And that will help him hopefully be favorably impressed as he also goes away and prepares his follow-up reports. We mentioned the war room. The war room is something we recommend you establish and have people trained for, so that during an inspection, that those who are in that room, which is a separate room from where the FDA and the company officials who are accompanying the inspector would be, this separate room is where you would manage and oversee the logistics of the inspection, including things like being ready to immediately receive all FDA requests. So somebody should be able to pick up a phone, or whether it's texting or whatever it is, immediately get a request from the QA person or others that are with the inspector in the during the inspection or in the conference room, and so they can immediately field those requests. That in that war room, those individuals can immediately retrieve and review all documents that are to be provided to the FDA, making sure they're in good condition, they don't have handwritten entries on them, there are no sticky notes, those sort of things. Ensure that anything provided to the FDA is what the FDA actually requested. You'll be surprised how many times, and we often are during an inspection, people will actually provide something to the FDA they did not request. You don't want to do that, obviously, for two reasons. One, the FDA expects to get what it requests, and you don't want to show things to the FDA they did not request. You want to make copies of everything provided to the FDA, and you want to keep notes of the inspection. So all those things should be happening in the so-called war room. In terms of the ongoing inspection, you want to make sure that you accompany the inspector at all times. The inspector or the inspector should be accompanied. If there's more than one inspector, and they obviously, in that case, will go in different directions, or likely will, you want to make sure there's at least one person always accompanying each inspector. You want to have someone accompanying the inspectors who will be taking notes, a scribe signed with that responsibility. Typically, it's a QC, QA person familiar with inspections to know what to record as to how the inspection is actually proceeding and what the inspector was looking at and inquiring about. Know the FDA authority, access to records, photographs, signing documents, access to employees and recordings. We've covered photographs, access to records. We'll talk a little bit about signing documents. Recordings, deny or the request to do recordings, the FDA will not challenge that. They may suggest and they put a recording device out and you'd say, I'm sorry, we don't really allow that. They will not challenge that, and they will not do recordings. In terms of accessing records, as we said earlier, the FDA has authority to access almost any records except for personnel files other than training and qualification records. You want to obtain duplicates of all FDA samples that they may have taken. You want to keep matching sets of labels. Obtain receipts for samples. They will give you a receipt, as we mentioned earlier, for any samples they ask for. Maintain a duplicate set of all documents presented to the FDA. You want to know afterwards exactly these are the things that were shared, given to the FDA. And then there's the question of affidavits. It's not unusual that the FDA inspector may present an affidavit to someone during the inspection asking that it be signed. Absolutely do not sign it. You're not required to sign an affidavit. Don't physically receive it from the inspector. Don't even listen to it being read. Refer the FDA to your legal counsel, and at doing that, they will almost always just simply drop the issue, and there'll be no longer any discussion about affidavits unless there's some really strong reason for them to want that, in which case your company's legal counsel and the FDA legal counsel will undoubtedly get involved. But most of the time, this will go nowhere when you say, I'm sorry, our policy is not to entertain or sign affidavits. Daily wrap-up should happen at the end of each day's inspection. It's a good opportunity to avoid surprises at the end of the inspection, and it's also an opportunity for you to make corrections that were about non-compliance issues that were observed during the inspection. And you want to make sure that when you are able to do that, that you apprise the investigator of the corrections you made. So there are some key benefits of the daily wrap-up. .483 observations. 483, as we mentioned earlier, lists the observations. It's a factual listing of any objectionable conditions. They're not going to talk about the good things they found. They're going to talk about objectionable conditions. Presented at the end of the inspections, that is the 483 it's discussed with management at the closeout meeting. An important part of having the discussion during this, rather than just listening to it, is there's an opportunity for the investigator, and they commonly will annotate the 483 with any corrective actions that you have been able to accomplish during the inspection, and also make note of any disputed observations or technical issues. Remember, we said it's okay to comment on something you may disagree with or feel it's a misunderstanding. Here's an opportunity for to clarify that, and the inspector will typically annotate the 483. So now we move into the post-inspection management piece, and typically there will be and should be a letter to the FDA addressing 483 observations. By regulatory requirements, it's not a requirement, but it's highly recommended, and it is the expectation of the FDA. Commit to corrective actions immediately. Don't wait for the 483 letter or warning letter. When you're responding, be sure you do it thoroughly, responding to every observation that was made and providing evidence of how you made the correction or the improvement. It is failing to do a good response to the 483s that leads to warning letters time after time after time. Be sure you do a thorough response to the 483s. Typically, you should do that within 15 days, just as you're required to do for warning letters. If you were to receive one, you're required to respond within 15 days. You want to assure in your responses any commitments you make are attainable. The FDA will confirm. Again, provide evidence of what you've accomplished and provide target timing for those things which are planned. And it's important to address the broad scope of the problems identified and have a global perspective in how you're addressing them. So as an example, if some inspector were to find a problem with a particular specification, you wouldn't want to respond just saying you fixed that specification and here is the corrected specification. It's expected that you'll go beyond that and talk about whether or not this applies to all specifications and have you corrected the problem in all of them. So address the response in a global fashion. These next couple items are things that happen within the, the first one is an establishment inspection report that you will likely receive somewhere within a period of 30 to, could be as long as 90 days. It's prepared by the inspection team and discusses the 43 findings in detail, and along with the firm's history. This next item is one you will not see typically. It's a EIR endorsement by the FDA internally, where they summarize important issues and observations and recommend appropriate action, which could be official action indicated, voluntary action indicated, or no action indicated. That's internal documentation. It's important to keep in mind that responding to these inspections, as I mentioned earlier, is very important to do it properly. And in doing the responses, we suggest monthly updates until all the observations have been formally addressed. That way the FDA will know you're committed to doing so. We suggest get professional help, especially when responding to 483s if your staff is relatively new or inexperienced. And we suggest always getting professional experience when you're dealing with responding to a warning letter, because there can be serious implications of a poor response to a warning letter. And just so that you're aware, EAS stands by, ready to help if you need help in any of those areas. If the FDA says there's no action indicated internally, then you should receive a copy of the final FDA EIR, as I said, within 30 to 90 days. If you don't receive it in a reasonable amount of time, there could be regulatory issues of concern being considered. And if you know your rights and are prepared, there will be likely no significant problems. So the point here is, don't be scared. Through all this, be prepared. We stress the importance of training, good SOPs, good documentation. Have that SOP on hosting an FDA inspection. Have strong internal self-inspection programs. That's very important to know you're keeping up to compliance as you intend to. And most of all, develop a company culture that quality is important and quality is everyone's responsibility. Thank you. That concludes the formal part of the presentation, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions you may have. As they are sent in, we'll take them one at a time.
If anyone has any questions of...
Just want to make note here. While they're coming in, I just want to make a comment that here's the contact information on your screen for the EAS consulting group, where, as I said, EAS is standing by, ready to help any of you who choose to contact us or feel you need help. EAS has a large professional staff with experienced former FDA officials in industry management, and we can assist you with virtually any aspect of regulatory compliance across the whole range of FDA-regulated industry. And you may want to refer to the EAS website there, easconsultinggroup.com, for more information about EAS.
Bruce, we have our first question. How often are affidavits brought up, and is this common?
Well, as we work with clients, my own experience is, I would guess, particularly in recently dealing with dietary supplement companies, I would say it can happen sometimes as much as 25% of the time. It really is very dependent upon the company itself, what the inspector is seeing, but it is not rare, I guess is the only way I can say it. It's difficult to quantify. Was there a second part to that question? I'm sorry.
The second part was, how common is it? You answered that.
Okay.
The second question, does FDA have a right to review complaints for the facility?
No. they do have a right to ask you and provide them enough assurance that you have a complaint program. They will have had access to some complaints through direct contacts to the FDA, but they do have and do comment. It's almost always part of an inspection that they will want to know you have a good complaint program in place with full documentation.